going to just briefly tell you how we've turned a exhibition we planned to have in place in September into a virtual exhibition that will open after Labor Day in the same fashion as our planned exhibition would have been, but online. And because I don't think we can realistically either assemble or invite people into our building soon after Labor Day, this will be literally a virtual exhibition. And I want to say, to start out with, this is, I'm asking for your forbearance, a distinguished visitor who spoke at an annual dinner of the Historical Society once asked me who previous annual dinner speakers had been. And in investigating that, I discovered that the annual dinner was in fact a reward for members of the Historical Society who came to the annual meeting. That is, making it worthwhile to sit through report things. In fact, tonight you're going to have the spinach, and now you're going to have more spinach, because I'm going to tell you about what we plan to do. And in this preview, we're talking about political cartoons. We approach in the fall as we approach the election, but we're focusing on political cartoons that illustrate how forces worked both to expand suffrage and to limit suffrage over the course of American history. And anchoring this exhibition is the cartoon of the gerrymander. The gift of Massachusetts, not just to the lexicon of American political science, but really to the world. This is a term that is now used everywhere to describe manipulating voting districts to get an effect. And if we can go to the next slide, this is considered to be the first American political cartoon that is join or die, cut for Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s during the French and Indian War. And part of this exhibition, this is of course not about voting rights specifically, but part of this exhibition is to not to tell the history of American political cartoons, to show you, and this is this is an image that appeared earlier this year in to illustrate a book review in the New York Times Book Review, playing off of the join or die cartoon from the 1750s. So a very long ways later, this still resonates with the public, this imagery, which has remained throughout. And one of the things we're going to try to do in our exhibition is, by showing historical political cartoons about these aspects of voting rights, and then inviting Boston area cartoonists to draw modern or present day takes on these subjects in previous cartoons, to put these things sort of side by side with each other. In an odd way, this is perhaps easier to do online than it would have been in a on the walls exhibition. And next. This is a famous cartoon by Thomas Nast, which I think gets to the heart of what we're trying to illustrate here, how voter manipulation and political corruption and gerrymandering and last, the Electoral College have all worked to limit or constrain political voting, while at the same time forces have been at work. And here we're talking about voting as a civil right in the 19th century, going on into the 20th century, women's suffrage, something that's very much on people's minds and is heavily illustrated when this was before the American public, and then voting by mail, which has a long history behind it, tracing back to the American Civil War. So their next slide. At the center of our story is this man, a portrait by Thomas Nast. Nast is not from here. He's drawn cartoons on Nash. He's a German immigrant as a child who starts his career before the Civil War as a teenager, becomes well known as a Civil War illustrator of magazines, illustrated magazines, and then has this remarkable career for more than 30 years with Harper's Weekly. But his cartoons are going to be at the center of this virtual exhibition, and we'll also ask Boston area cartoonists to create essentially a virtual comic strip, which will tell the story of Nast's life and career through cartoons, present-day cartoons. And next, this is one of the things is, because these cartoons we have commissioned aren't ready yet, I've inserted into my slideshow some recent professional cartoons that bear upon some of these topics that we're asking present-day cartoonists to address. And here's the essence of what we're getting. It does, is it who votes or who counts the votes is the central part of this dilemma. And next. Now, in the case of Nast, he's probably best known for his fight against political corruption centered in New York and then elsewhere, famously the battle against the boss Tweed in the Tweed Ring, Tammany in New York, illustrated with an extraordinary graphic here from Harper's, a double-spread page from Harper's Weekly. But at the same time, Nast has a career in standing against the prevention of newly enfranchised Black people throughout American voting. And go to the next slide. Oh, and before we go to the next part of my point is Nast is also someone who's not responsible for the images we associate with political parties in every case, but certainly popularized here. And here he manages to get both the elephant and the donkey into a slide that also, even though he was very sympathetic to immigration, Chinese immigration, he managed to get stereotypes all together in a single cartoon. And here his disgust is reflected in how the Republican and Democratic Party vie to be more stringent in excluding Chinese immigrants from America. And next. And now the first part of our exhibition that I want to discuss in just briefly, but just in a little bit more detail. And this is this extraordinary cartoon that he drew about the massacre of Black civilians in New Orleans and the aftermath of the Civil War and the return of white control. And this may be a little hard to see. There's a lot going on in this cartoon and a lot to explain that I won't do this evening. But this is President Johnson as the Roman emperor figure looking down upon the massacre of the Christian martyrs, the Black population and Black voters in New Orleans. I'll just point out that in the foreground, this armored Roman is George Custer, who accompanied Johnson on his tours. And over in the left, you can see General Grant in armor preventing Phil Sheridan, the military governor of Louisiana, from drawing his sword to attack the the Nero-like Johnson. And next. But this argument that Nast carried forward about political rights for former slaves carries forward through as a thread, just as his attack on political corruption through the mid-19th century, the post-Reconstruction, post-Civil War period. And next. And what we have the benefit of, I'm showing you other modern professional cartoonists' work as to give you some sense of how these cartoons we have commissioned will be in play with historical cartoons. here, the life work of Herb Bloch is in the hands of a nonprofit organization, a foundation, and they were generous to offer us the use of images from Herb Bloch's life work to illustrate the exhibition we have planned, and now have continued that to allow us to place on our website examples of Herb Bloch's work. And here again, 100 years after the work of Thomas Nast, essentially Herb Bloch addressed in the 1960s the same issues about voting rights and civil rights from the 1960s. And next. And next. Well, oh, and Nast was not enlightened about everything. This is his cartoon of Victoria Woodhull, "Get Thee Behind Me, Mrs. Satan," the kind of first moves towards the women's suffrage on the new drive for women's suffrage in the 1860s and 70s. But our collection is very large, and if you go to the next slide, you'll see the work of, this is Laura Foster. This is where a woman cartoonist enters our story, or one piece of our story. And here, but this is perhaps more complicated than people think, because here's Laura Foster writing, drawing for a cover of the magazine Life, a pro-woman suffrage cartoon. And if you go to the next, cartoonists are not always driven by their own political beliefs, because here's the same artist drawing for the same magazine, and here is something that can only be interpreted as an anti-suffrage illustration. So this is a more complicated story than we might think of. And if you go to the next slide, the absent vote, as voting by mail was first called. This is a vignette from within a large-scale cartoon that Nast drew, illustrating the victory of Lincoln in the election of 1864. And one of the panels of this large format cartoon, he shows soldiers voting in the field, which played an important role in the election of 1864, and really goes back to the origins of voting by mail, another thing that expanded suffrage. And if we go to the next slide, this is a Bill Malden cartoon from the Second World War, reprinted in his memoir written right at the end of the war up front. Malden won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning in 1945, and he said this was probably the only truly editorial cartoon he had drawn during the war. But this is, in 1944, there was a large-scale controversy about, because of federal support of soldiers voting from elsewhere and overseas, implicit in that was that Black soldiers would be able to vote in the election. So this became a states' rights issue and complicated the election of 1944. And next, this is a modern day, a practically present day, Tom Towles cartoon commenting about the circumstance we find ourselves on. I haven't met Towles, but he has a wonderful connection to the Historical Society, because he was a favorite nephew of former librarian and director of the Historical Society, Stephen Riley. So we have a connection to him. But this is what we're looking for from the Boston cartoonists who are drawing from us. And to go to the next. And then, of course, the gerrymander itself, as far as restricting and controlling the not voters' rights, but the value of votes by controlling voting districts. And we'll have more to say about the history of that. And then next. And this is a ballot box from the middle of the 19th century. This is a Nast cartoon. There's very little by way of cartoons, political cartoons about the Electoral College until relatively recently, although this was a lifelong campaign of Herb Bloch to sort of push back against the Electoral College. Every 4 years he would, for more than 40 years, he would create cartoons. I like this image about the voting being sort of battered by different forces, but this is explicitly, it needs a little bit of explanation, but explicitly about the Electoral College, because this is the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, when the Electoral College vote was contested and very close, and in fact, the election was placed in the hands of Electoral College Commission. But this is what's complicating about historical cartoons, that you have to provide context, often provide context for them. And then next. And even though Nast drew cartoons for a national audience through Harper's and then his own illustrated magazine, there were some Massachusetts and Boston characters who really were national figures. And this is probably the person who was more hated under the roof of the Massachusetts Historical Society than in any other place except Louisiana, and that's Stormy Ben Butler, who is threatening the infant in the cradle of liberty, that is Massachusetts. So this personification of figures from Massachusetts was, Massachusetts stood out even in the politics of the 19th century. And then next. And in terms of personification, here's Boss Tweed from Nast, illustrated as a animate money bag, but recognizably having his diamond stick pin upon him. And if we go to the next, Herb Bloch used, he essentially put a face on the atomic bomb, and supposedly this is a pretty good image of what early atomic bombs looked like. And this is a trope of cartoons over the whole course of American history. That is the figure of Robinson Crusoe finding something. And here, Robinson Crusoe, in the form of Mr. Adam, as this figure became known, discovers the footprint in the sand, which is the first Russian explosion of an atomic weapon. And next. And then we're going to have part of our exhibition, because we're going to have it divided into these sections, but part of it has always been planned to be useful to people who find this presentation confusing or complicated, and especially addressed to students. And addressing stereotypes in political cartoons right up to the present, and how even cartoons that celebrate advances, in this case, Black civil rights and Black voting, and there's a veteran soldier with his sergeant stripes preparing to vote, that from Harper's, that nevertheless stereotypes creep into these illustrations. And if we go on to the next, which is only a few years later, we find the stereotypes of everything criticized in Reconstruction. The comical figures being misled by the corrupt and conniving. And Nast is a perfect example of this. We go to the next slide, which is the Irishman trying to find a leak in a gunpowder barrel with a lighted torch, a trope that goes back to the earliest days of American history. But nevertheless, it's not simply racist stereotypes, but also, certainly in the case of Nast, stereotypes of brutish, simian, Irish men, and there is a streak of anti-Catholicism through his cartoons that's really quite remarkable. There's been a struggle about whether or not he should be in the New Jersey place where he lived during his professional career, New Jersey Hall of Fame. And for all the people who admire them, there is an equivalent number who despise him for these stereotypes. And next, but our plan is to discuss all these things and also help people in deciphering cartoons which are not without their mystery. This is a cartoon from the 1864 election where the General McClellan, the Democratic candidate, two-faced General McClellan, stands on the Chicago platform, the platform of the Democratic Party, and the Irish ruffian is a supporter. The valiant soldier on the left is for supporting this. The platform of the Democratic Party is held up by copperheads in the front, and then the devil and Jeff Davis in the rear. But this a lot to sort of explain when we use these cartoons, and this is something we're going to provide so these can be useful for educators and students. And next, and here I end, maybe on a happier note. This is because he was a very satirical and had essentially a bleak vision of human capacity. It's in some respects charming to find this image of from Nast from at the time of the battle over the 15th Amendment, where he has this idea that everyone is invited to the table. Uncle Sam is carving at one end, and Columbia at the other end, the personification of America, who's said to bear a striking resemblance to Mrs. Nast, are having all these recent immigrants from everywhere, and figures like the Native American, feathered Native American on the far side of the table, all at Thanksgiving dinner. And the pantheon of Nast heroes, Lincoln, Washington, and General Grant are on the a wall behind it. And then over in the corner is the image of Castle Garden, which which was the place where immigrants arrived in New York and primarily in America during this period. But this idea that the world could be made over or made anew, which is, I hope, is a happy way to end this little preview, which will expand in a lot more directions from here, but just give you an idea of what we're trying to do. And
I just want to thank everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for attending. And thank you for supporting the Historical Society.